Is that your legal argument? Or did you forget you're in a courtroom, not a cleaning shift? The laughter came fast, sharp, echoing off the polished wood and marble like it belonged there. Heads turned. Suits shifted. A few quiet chuckles slipped through clenched jaws as Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the leather, confidence radiating from every inch of his tailored navy suit. His voice had cut through the room just seconds earlier, precise and dismissive, the kind of tone that didn't just question, it erased. Near the side aisle, just beyond the line of attorneys and assistants, Maya Williams stood still, a cart of cleaning supplies at her side, the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the air around her. Her uniform was simple, pressed, but worn at the seams, her name stitched in small letters over her chest like it barely deserved space. She hadn't meant to speak. Not here. Not in a room where decisions shaped lives in minutes, and words carried weight she wasn't supposed to touch. But she had heard it. That one line, buried halfway down the page in the document Ethan had just presented with effortless authority. A clause that didn't sound wrong, unless you really listened. And she had. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth in her hand, knuckles paling just enough to catch the light filtering through the tall courtroom windows. The sunlight stretched across the floor in long, quiet beams, reflecting off polished surfaces and expensive shoes, stopping just short of where she stood. Invisible, but not quite. Ethan's gaze flicked toward her again, amused now, entertained by the disruption. "You've got something to add?" he asked, not expecting an answer, already smiling at the thought of one. A few people shifted in their seats, curious. Others looked away, uncomfortable but silent. Maya lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, not in challenge, just enough to breathe. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm for the space she occupied. "That clause, it reverses liability," she said. "No rush. No apology. Just fact." The room didn't react immediately. It paused, like something unseen had brushed against it. Then came the quiet ripple of disbelief. A scoff. A muted laugh. Someone whispered, "She's a maid." Ethan exhaled through a grin, shaking his head like he'd just been handed a joke. "That's not how this works," he replied, voice smooth, practiced. "You don't walk into a courtroom and rewrite legal interpretation because you think you spotted something." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The dismissal was cleaner that way. More final. Maya didn't step forward. Didn't argue. She simply looked at the document again, eyes steady, as if the truth didn't require volume. The judge hadn't spoken yet. Not a word. But from behind the bench, beneath the weight of years and authority, Judge Harold Bennett had stopped writing. His pen hovered just above the page, unmoving. And for the first time since the laughter began, the room began to feel different. Not louder, not quieter, just held, suspended in something no one had named yet. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, still composed, still certain, but something, small, almost unnoticeable, tightened in his jaw. Because the woman he had just dismissed hadn't backed down. She hadn't disappeared. And in a place where presence meant power, that alone was enough to change what happened next. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, like a thread pulled too tight across the room. And in that fragile space Maya Williams remained exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly against the metal handle of the cleaning cart, the other still holding the cloth she had forgotten to move, her posture neither defensive nor bold, just present, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. While a few rows ahead a junior associate leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath, the word janitor barely contained behind a smirk, and yet no one laughed this time. Not fully, because something in the air had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a verdict is read when even breathing feels too loud, and Ethan Caldwell felt it too, though he would not name it. Instead, he straightened his cuff with deliberate precision, smoothing the fabric as though control could be. Restored through routine, his expression still composed, but his eyes flicking once more toward the document in his hand, just for a fraction of a second longer than before, because her words, simple as they were, had landed somewhere inconvenient, somewhere he could not immediately dismiss. And across the room the soft ticking of the courtroom clock became suddenly noticeable, each second marking the distance between certainty and doubt. While Maya's gaze did not wander, It stayed anchored to the page he held, not challenging him, not pleading, simply waiting. And that patience carried a quiet weight, the kind that did not demand attention but earned it anyway, until finally a chair creaked as someone shifted, then another, and the gallery behind them leaned forward almost in unison, drawn not by spectacle but by the absence of it, because nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything felt like it was about to. And near the bench, Judge Harold Bennett lowered his pen slowly onto the desk, the faint click echoing louder than it should have, his eyes lifting from the notes in front of him to the woman by the aisle, studying her not as a disruption, but as a variable, something unaccounted for in a room built on structure. And when he spoke, his voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It carried the kind of authority that settled rather than struck. "Miss Williams," he said, reading the name as if confirming it against memory, and Maya's shoulders rose with a quiet breath, not surprise but recognition, because this was no longer about being overlooked. This was about being seen, fully and without dismissal. And a ripple moved through the courtroom again, different this time, sharper, more focused, as if every person present suddenly understood that the moment had crossed a line none of them had expected. And Ethan's hand paused against the edge of the paper, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly, because whatever came next was no longer entirely under his control. And for the first time since he had spoken, the confidence in his posture held a fracture, small but real, while Maya let the cloth fall gently back onto the cart, her fingers releasing it as if shedding something unnecessary. Her steps forward measured and steady against the polished floor, each footfall soft but deliberate, carrying her out of the space she was meant to occupy and into one she had never been invited to claim. And as she moved, the light from the tall windows followed, catching the edge of her uniform, outlining her not as background but as presence, undeniable now. And in that quiet walk from the margins to the center, the room did not breathe, did not speak, it simply watched, waiting for the truth she carried to finally be heard. Every step Maya took seemed to echo longer than it should have, not because the room was loud, but because it had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that made even the smallest movement feel deliberate, undeniable. And as she reached the open space before the bench, she stopped exactly where the light settled brightest across the polished floor, her posture straight but unforced, her hands now empty, no cloth, no cart, nothing to hold on to except her own voice. And for a brief second, she closed her eyes, not in hesitation but in memory, as if grounding herself somewhere far from the weight of the room, somewhere quieter, where words were not measured by status but by truth. And when she opened them again, she did not look at Ethan. She looked at the document, and then at the judge, because that was where it mattered, while behind her the faint rustle of shifting bodies returned, subtle, restrained, people leaning forward just enough to see more clearly, to hear what had already begun to feel important. And Ethan Caldwell adjusted his stance as he rose halfway from his seat, not fully standing but no longer relaxed, his hand tightening around the edge of the table, his confidence still present but now layered with something else, something cautious, as if he were recalculating in real time, because the script had changed and he had not written this part. And Judge Bennett watched both of them carefully, his expression neutral but attentive, the kind of attention that weighed without judgment. And when he spoke again, his tone remained even, controlled. "You mentioned a reversal of liability, Miss Williams," he said, each word placed with intention. "Explain what you mean." And there it was, not a challenge, not a dismissal, but an invitation, rare and precise. And Maya nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible, before she reached forward slightly, not touching the document, but tracing its presence in the air, her voice steady, clear. "The clause on page 14, subsection C," she began, not rushing, not faltering. "It appears to assign conditional protection to the defendant, but the phrasing allows liability to transfer retroactively under external review." And a few brows in the room lifted, subtle but real, as she continued. "That means if any compliance issue is raised after the agreement is finalized, responsibility does not stay with the originating party. It shifts entirely to the signing party." And now the silence deepened, because what she was saying was not opinion. It was structure, it was language dissected with precision, and Ethan's eyes dropped to the page again, faster this time, scanning, his jaw tightening as the words rearranged themselves in his mind. No longer harmless, no longer background. While Maya did not look at him, she kept her focus forward. It is written to sound protective, she added, softer now. But it is not. And somewhere in the gallery a pen stopped mid-note. Someone else leaned closer, and the weight of her explanation settled across the room like a quiet realization unfolding in slow motion, and Judge Bennett's gaze sharpened just slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because this was not guesswork, this was understanding, and he turned his attention toward Ethan without speaking, giving him space, giving him time, and for the first time since the laughter had started, Ethan did not respond immediately. He did not dismiss. He did not smile. He simply looked at the page in his hand. The same page he had presented with certainty minutes ago, now holding something he had missed, something a woman he had not considered had seen clearly. And in that pause, that single suspended moment, the balance of the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that everyone felt it, because authority had been questioned, and truth had not come from where it was expected. The weight of her words did not fade. It settled deeper, pressing into every corner of the courtroom until even the air felt denser, harder to move through. And for a long second no one spoke. Not the clerks, not the observers, not even the attorneys who had spent years mastering the art of interruption, because what Maya had done was not loud. It was not forceful, but it was precise. And precision had a way of silencing everything around it. And Ethan Caldwell felt that silence wrap around him. As he lowered his gaze again to the document, this time slower, more deliberate, his fingers adjusting the page as though the angle might change what he saw. But the words remained, fixed and unyielding, and now they carried a different meaning, one he could not easily dismiss. And he inhaled once, controlled, measured, before finally speaking, his tone still composed but no longer effortless. That interpretation assumes a post-agreement trigger that is not explicitly defined, he said, choosing each word carefully, building his argument back piece by piece, as if reconstructing ground he had just lost, and a few heads nodded in the room, relieved perhaps that the structure they understood was being restored, that authority was reclaiming its place. But Maya did not step back, did not shrink under the response. She simply listened, her expression unchanged, absorbing his words fully before answering. And when she did, her voice remained calm, steady. "It is defined," she said. Not louder, not sharper, just clear. "It is embedded in the compliance review language on page 16. And now the shift was immediate, sharper this time. As multiple eyes moved across documents almost in unison, pages turning softly, pens pausing midair, and Ethan's hand stilled again, his jaw tightening just enough to betray the pressure beneath his control, because he had read this document. He had reviewed it, prepared it, trusted it, and yet she was moving through it with a clarity that felt unsettlingly complete. And across the bench Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlacing as he watched, not intervening, allowing the exchange to unfold, because something important was happening beneath the surface, something that did not belong to routine procedure. And Maya continued, not rushing, not filling space unnecessarily. "If the review identifies discrepancies after execution, the liability shifts under subsection C," she said, her eyes briefly meeting the judge's before returning to the invisible outline of the document. "That creates a delayed transfer of responsibility." And now, the room responded in quieter ways, a subtle intake of breath, a glance exchanged between two senior attorneys, the kind of reaction that did not need sound to be understood. And Ethan straightened fully now, no longer half-seated, his posture firm, controlled, but the ease from earlier had vanished, replaced by focus, by calculation, because he could not laugh this away, not anymore. And for a moment he said nothing, not because he had no answer, but because the answer required time, and time was something he no longer fully owned in this moment. And Maya stood across from him, not triumphant, not confrontational, simply present, her stillness anchoring the space in a way that demanded acknowledgement. And as the seconds stretched, the balance of the room tilted further, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with quiet inevitability, because the truth she had pointed to was not fading, it was expanding, filling the gaps that had been overlooked, and Judge Bennett finally shifted. His gaze between them, the silence now complete, waiting not for noise, not for dominance, but for clarity. And in that waiting, the courtroom understood something it had not at the beginning, that this was no longer a moment of interruption, it was a moment of reckoning, unfolding one careful word at a time. The room did not move, it tightened. Every sound pulled inward as if the walls themselves were listening, and Ethan Caldwell felt the shift settle fully now, no longer subtle, no longer something he could smooth over with tone or posture, because the argument was no longer his alone. It was in the air, shared, examined, and he could see it in the way the senior partner at the back leaned forward, in the way a clerk stopped typing mid-sentence, in the way even the opposing counsel no longer avoided eye contact but watched with quiet intensity. And for a brief moment Ethan said nothing, his eyes scanning the document again, slower than before, tracing each line as though the meaning might rearrange itself under pressure, but it did not. It held, firm and unyielding. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sharper edge, controlled but undeniably strained. That reading depends on an interpretation of intent, he said, lifting his gaze toward Maya, no longer dismissive, now focused. Contracts are not judged on hypothetical outcomes, they are judged on explicit terms. And a few nods followed, faint but present, the room reaching for familiar ground again, for something structured, something predictable, and Ethan took a small step forward, reclaiming space. There is no direct statement that liability transfers automatically, he added, his confidence, rebuilding word by word. Only a conditional framework that requires further review. And for a second it seemed as though the balance might shift back, as though authority might reassert itself through clarity and repetition. But Maya did not retreat. She did not falter. She simply listened, her expression steady, absorbing every word without interruption. And when he finished, she let a brief silence settle, not as hesitation but as space, the kind of space that allowed truth to land fully, before being answered. And then she spoke again, softer than before, but somehow more grounded. "It is not hypothetical," she said, her eyes moving briefly toward the bench before returning forward. "The condition is triggered by any compliance review initiated by a third party." And now the tension sharpened again, because this was not a new argument. It was a refinement, a narrowing, a precision that left less room to deflect, and she continued. "That means the transfer does not require admission of fault, only the existence of a review." And a murmur passed through the gallery, quiet but unmistakable, because that distinction mattered. It changed everything. And Ethan's jaw tightened further, his fingers pressing against the edge of the table, the paper no longer steady in his grip, because he could see it now, not just hear it, the structure she was outlining, the path she was tracing through language he had trusted. And for the first time, uncertainty settled visibly into his posture, not overwhelming, not breaking, but present, undeniable. And Judge Bennett watched closely, his gaze shifting between them with measured attention, allowing the exchange to continue, because what was unfolding was not just disagreement, it was revelation. And Maya took a small breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly, before adding one final piece. "It is written to protect the appearance of balance," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "But it ensures the risk does not stay where it begins." And this time the silence that followed was heavier, deeper, because there was nothing rushed in her explanation, nothing exaggerated, only clarity layered upon clarity until the truth could no longer be ignored. And Ethan did not respond immediately. He could not because he lacked knowledge, but because the ground beneath his certainty had shifted too far to stand on without adjustment. And in that pause, that suspended breath of a moment, the courtroom understood something had changed permanently, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the woman who had been dismissed minutes ago was now defining the terms of the room, and no one, not even the man who had laughed first, could undo that shift. The silence did not break this time. It settled deeper, softer, like a weight that no one wanted to disturb. And for a moment the courtroom felt less like a place of argument and more like a space caught between breaths, suspended in something unspoken, while sunlight stretched further across the polished floor, climbing slowly up the edge of the bench, touching the corner of the document still held in Ethan Caldwell's hand. And he did not move. Not immediately, his eyes fixed on the page, no longer scanning, no longer searching, just holding, as if the answer might rise from it if he stayed still long enough. But it did not. It remained exactly as she had described it, quiet, precise, undeniable, and his shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, not yet, but in recognition that the moment had slipped beyond control, while across from him Maya Williams stood without shifting her weight, her posture calm, her breathing even, the tension that had filled the room no longer pressing against her but moving around her, as if she had stepped into a place where it could not reach. And in that stillness her eyes softened just slightly, not toward Ethan, not toward the room, but inward, as if remembering something far from the marble and wood and structured voices, something quieter, older, where knowledge was not measured by titles or seats at the table, and the faint sound of a pen being set down echoed again, softer this time, as Judge Bennett leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady, thoughtful, not rushing to speak, allowing the silence to complete itself. Because there was value in what had just happened, value that could not be rushed or overwritten, and a few rows back someone exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that had been held too long, while another shifted in their seat, not out of discomfort but out of awareness, as if the room itself had changed shape, and Ethan finally lifted his head, his eyes moving from the document to Maya, not with dismissal, not with amusement, but with something quieter, more measured, a recognition that had not been there before, and he did not speak, not yet, because there was nothing immediate to say that would restore what had been lost, and that absence of words carried its own weight, heavier than any argument. While Maya did not meet his gaze, she simply stood, her presence steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, no longer holding anything, not even the tension from before, and the light from the windows framed her now, outlining her against the stillness, not as someone who had interrupted, but as someone who had revealed. And Judge Bennett's eyes moved once more between them, his fingers resting lightly against the bench, before he leaned forward just enough to signal that the moment had reached its edge, not with force, not with finality, but with quiet intention. And still no one spoke, because sometimes clarity did not need to be announced. It simply existed, filling the space where doubt had been, and in that lingering quiet, the courtroom understood something deeper than argument, something that would not fade when voices returned, that truth, when spoken with certainty and without fear, did not need permission to be heard. It only needed a moment, and that moment had already happened. Judge Bennett did not raise his voice when he finally spoke, but the shift was immediate, like a line drawn across the room that no one could step back over. "Counselor," he said, his gaze resting on Ethan Caldwell with quiet authority. "Approach." And the word carried more than instruction, it carried consequence. And Ethan moved forward, not reluctantly, not slowly, but without the ease he had carried before, his steps measured, his posture still composed but no longer effortless, because the ground beneath him had changed, and he could feel it in the way every eye followed, not with admiration now, but with expectation. And as he reached the bench he placed the document down carefully, as though the weight of it had increased, and Judge Bennett leaned slightly closer, scanning the page himself, not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate, his finger tracing a single line before moving to another, and the seconds stretched, long enough for the room to settle into a deeper kind of silence, the kind that did not ask for sound to fill it. While Maya remained where she stood, just behind the line she had crossed moments ago, her presence still, grounded, her eyes no longer fixed on the paper but on the space between what had been said and what was about to be acknowledged. And then the judge nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, before looking up again. "The language is as she described," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with clarity that did not leave room for interpretation, and a ripple moved through the courtroom, sharper this time, because confirmation changed everything. It turned possibility into fact, and Ethan's expression did not break, but it tightened, his jaw setting as the realization settled fully, not as a sudden blow but as a slow, undeniable shift, because the oversight was real, and it had not come from the person expected to catch it. And Judge Bennett continued, his tone steady. The clause creates a conditional transfer that could expose the signing party to disproportionate liability. And now the language was formal, precise, but the meaning was unmistakable, and Ethan straightened slightly, drawing a breath as if to respond, to recover, to reframe, but the words did not come immediately, because there was no clean path back from what had just been confirmed. And for the first time since the proceedings began, he stood without control of the narrative, and behind him the quiet murmur returned, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the sound of recognition moving through the room. While Maya did not react outwardly, she did not step forward, did not claim the moment. She simply remained still, her expression unchanged, as if the validation did not elevate her but simply aligned the room with what had already been true. And Judge Bennett shifted his attention back to her, his gaze measured, assessing not just her words but her understanding. And there was something in that look that had not been there before, not curiosity, not doubt, but respect, unspoken yet clear. And as the silence settled once more, it carried a different weight now, not tension, not uncertainty, but resolution beginning to take shape, because what had been dismissed had been proven, and what had been overlooked had been brought into full view. And in that moment the balance of the courtroom was no longer shifting. It had already moved, firmly, irreversibly, and everyone present could feel it. No one spoke for a moment after the judge's words settled, not because they were unclear, but because they were final in a way that did not need emphasis. And Ethan Caldwell remained standing at the bench, his hand still resting near the document. Though now it no longer looked like something he controlled, it looked like something that had exposed him, and for the first time since he had entered the room. His posture shifted in a way that was almost human, less constructed, less certain. And he drew a slow breath before turning slightly, not toward the gallery, not toward his client, but toward Maya Williams, and the movement itself carried weight, because it acknowledged her, not as an interruption, not as a mistake, but as part of the outcome. And when he spoke his voice was quieter than before, not weak, but measured in a different way. "Miss Williams," he said, pausing just briefly as if choosing the words carefully. "Your observation was accurate." And the room did not react loudly. There was no gasp, no sudden shift, only a subtle change in posture among those watching. Because recognition did not need spectacle, it needed sincerity. And Ethan continued, his tone steady but stripped of the earlier edge. "I overlooked that interaction between the clauses, and the admission, simple as it was, carried more weight than any argument he had made earlier, because it was not forced. It was chosen." And Maya met his gaze for the first time since stepping forward, her expression calm, not triumphant, not vindictive, just present, as if the acknowledgement did not elevate her. It simply restored balance, and she gave a small nod, nothing more, no words, because none were needed. And Judge Bennett observed the exchange without interruption, his eyes moving between them with quiet approval, not of the mistake, but of the correction. And after a moment he leaned forward again, his voice steady. "The court will require a revised submission addressing the liability structure before proceeding," he said, returning the focus to the case, grounding the moment back into process. But the atmosphere had changed too much to return to what it had been, and Ethan nodded once, accepting the directive, his movements controlled, but no longer carrying the same effortless confidence, because something fundamental had shifted. And as he stepped back from the bench, his eyes flicked once more toward the document, not with ownership, but with reflection, as if seeing it for the first time. While Maya remained where she was for a second longer, the light still catching the edge of her uniform, before she quietly stepped back as well, returning toward the space she had come from, though it no longer felt the same. And as she reached her cart, she picked up the cloth again, her fingers closing around it gently, not as a symbol of where she belonged, but simply as part of what she carried. And around the room the quiet resumed, but it was different now, not empty, not tense, but settled, shaped by what had just unfolded. And in that stillness the lines between roles, between status, between expectation, felt less rigid, as if for a brief moment they had been redrawn. And though no one said it aloud, everyone present understood that what had happened would not be forgotten, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. and truth, once seen clearly, did not return to the shadows it came from. The courtroom did not erupt when it ended. It softened, as if the energy that had built so tightly throughout the exchange simply released into something quieter, something settled, and one by one people returned to their seats. Papers were gathered, pens resumed their movement across legal pads, but the rhythm was different now, slower, more aware, as if each action carried the memory of what had just unfolded. And Ethan Caldwell moved back to his table without the same precision he had carried before, his steps still controlled but no longer rehearsed, his hand brushing briefly against the back of the chair before he sat, his eyes lingering for a moment on the document in front of him, not with frustration, not with denial, but with reflection, as if he were seeing not just the words, but the space between them, the space he had overlooked. And across the room, Maya Williams adjusted the handle of her cart slightly, aligning it with the edge of the aisle, her movement small, deliberate, as though returning to something familiar. But there was no sense of retreat in it, no shrinking back into invisibility, because the room no longer allowed that version of her to exist. And as she lifted the cloth again and gently ran it across the surface of a wooden railing, the motion was steady, unhurried, the same as before, and yet entirely different, because now every person in that room knew who she was. Not by title, not by role, but by what she had revealed. And near the bench, Judge Bennett gathered his notes, closing the file with a soft, final sound that carried more meaning than any spoken conclusion, his expression calm, composed, but with a depth that had not been there at the start, as if the case had shifted in more ways than one. And as he rose, the courtroom followed its usual order, chairs sliding back, quiet footsteps moving toward the exits. But even in that routine, there was a lingering stillness, a shared awareness that something had been corrected, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision and integrity. And Ethan stood once more, his gaze moving across the room until it found Maya again, and for a brief second he paused, not out of obligation, but out of recognition.